it's worth remembering first and foremost that these were the same leftists that were more than happy to point out the problem with Donald Trump's tariff policy was the fact that the tariff would simply be passed on, wouldn't actually be paid by the overseas businesses. It was just going to be paid for by the American consumer because they would simply pass on the cost. Okay, they were perfectly willing to adopt that argument. But all of a sudden, when it comes to any other form of taxes, and we predicted this from the outset. We're like, I guarantee you, these leftists that are talking about how bad tariffs are because of the pass-on effect will not be talking about this for any other taxes. And sure enough, that's exactly what's happened. But like, it is just objectively the case that when a price, a tax cut occurs in the case of typically, a final good or final product or something of that nature, or so I should say, a tax that affects final goods. So whether it's a VAT or sales tax or those sorts of things, that 100% there is going to be a pass-on effect where prices are going to drop as a result. Okay, that's just obviously going to happen because you're reducing the cost that's being paid by the producer or by the seller of this final good so they can afford to reduce prices. But again, it needs to be clarified. This is where we do need to do a better job in some cases, I think, of clarifying that it isn't because the producer or the seller feels good or is feeling nice that they decide to reduce the price of their goods. It's because they have no choice. Okay, because if they don't, then someone else will. And if someone else does, then people will start purchasing from that person rather than them. So they need to reduce their prices proactively in line with what other people will be reducing their prices by, lest they have their market share cut off. So do you kind of agree with me, Zulu, that at times it is kind of treated by some free market people that it is going to be done by these producers, that they're going to reduce their prices just because they're nice people rather than because it's kind of in their own self-interest, I suppose?
Yeah, I think the better way to understand it is what you're getting at. It's sort of the keys to power idea that you see from that CGP Grey video, where in fact in order to be in their position to sell and be profitable, they have their own requirements. They can't just arbitrarily do whatever the hell they want, right? And this is parodied very nicely in the economic analog, in that whole when somebody brings up the graph of how expensive things are or what have you, and it's this is an era of corporate greed and this is an era of corporate generosity. It's no, that's exactly what we're trying to critique here. So Diego Amateur says it in chat. Yes, it's the greed generosity timeline meme. Yeah, that's not what's going on. Equally, there is no corporate greed, corporate generosity. I think we can all acknowledge that, the leftists certainly. But then, by that same breath, there also isn't corporate greed. That's not the reason why prices are high. It's not because the corporations were greedy. It's because that's the only price that they can possibly sell for, right? There's a very limited window, a very limited range of possible prices that they can possibly sell for without going bankrupt, or without going bankrupt, because if they sell for too high a price, then nobody's going to buy it, and then they run out of money, right? So they've got to stick within that window, and that window is affected by things like taxes. And I do like this. Let's think this idea of let's consider different places where we could put the tax. If it's just literally at the counter, a VAT, they're producing for a certain price, they're selling for a certain price, and then the government is effectively standing there and adding extra money and adding an extra chunk of that money at the till, in effect, with a VAT. Well, if you remove that, then obviously the price is going to drop by however much the VAT is, right? Because you're no longer adding that extra chunk. Well, let's push it back a further step in the line of production, right? And instead it's in the delivery of goods to the final store, right? That's where the price is. Well, that's going to be priced in still, right? They're not retarded. They're not going to just eat that cost, because then they're suddenly outside of that window of possible prices. So they're going to go bankrupt if they do that. So now they've got to bump up their prices so that gets priced in, and they're back within the window of acceptable prices. Or you can push it further back and further back and further back, and it's still all going to get priced in such that they're still in the window of possible prices. So you remove any of those, and suddenly they're outside the window of possible prices, still, right? So then they've got to reduce their prices, right? That's how it's, pardon me, that's how it's going to work for any trade, not just the consumer level, but any trades further back or anything going on further back. It's still got to be priced in, or else companies go bankrupt, and companies do not want to go bankrupt. That's the last thing they want to do, right? So yeah, it's not greed or generosity. It is the necessities of the situation you put them in, given scarcity.
Right, and to your point, like at the end of the day, all of these taxes impact the economy somehow. It's just a case of where exactly they're going to be found, and this is a really pernicious thing. Is yeah, it can be difficult to work out. Okay, if I increase the income tax by 2%, well, where exactly is that going to impact prices? Well, it's hard to know. I mean, on some level, it impacts purchasing power because obviously people get less money for every hour worked. So every hour worked, can purchase them less goods. But just in general, it is difficult to figure out where exactly this is going to be felt within the marketplace. So that's obviously one of the difficult. That's one of the downsides of not the downsides of markets, but the downsides of trying to analyze markets is it can be often quite difficult to figure out. Okay, where exactly is this tax being felt? It's relatively easier when it comes to like a fuel excise tax. Like, well, if you cut the fuel excise, then fuel's going to get cheaper. That's fairly easy to surmise from the tax. But I wanted to hit up another one of these tweets. So you mentioned this one earlier, and this person deleted the main tweet because I ratioed them, I guess. Which I mean, look, I've been ratioed over the course of this uh, over the course of this discourse by dumb retarded commies who say dumb retarded shit, but all agree with one another. So take that with a grain of salt. But the actual position that this guy was talking about was, as you said, he basically said that like libertarians more or less need to get better. And I think this guy was a classical liberal, to be fair. But people who are advocating for free market positions need to do better at like making populist arguments or showing people why our ideas should win in the free marketplace of ideas, so to speak. And my response was that look, the problem for the problem that we face as libertarians is that most of our prescriptions when it comes to economic policy, which is to say we have no prescription for the government to do anything, we want it to do nothing. The problem with that is that those policies are generally low tide preference. There's can be exceptions, of course, but fundamentally, the problem that we face is we want people to be able to think forward, like be forward looking and look towards the future. But the democracy explicitly tends against this tendency. Is the tendency for democracy is to be relatively high time preference because you have a limited time, or politicians have a limited window in which to maximize their capital accumulation from their position of power. So they're disincentivized from enacting long-term policies, which would be good for people, but reduce their ability to take advantage of their access to the capital stock of the nation. So, yeah, we're fighting against the interests of the politicians. And so I suppose I wanted to get your thoughts on this as well. Like, there is this dilemma here where, we'd like to be able to, get these ideas to become popular, but it's really difficult when we're fighting against the incentives that are at play when it comes to the actors that hold power and their ability to enact policies.
Yeah, because first you have to solve the fundamental problems of having the correct philosophy in place. So people actually start caring about reality. They don't care about I wish, how many wishes you get. Right? They stop caring about that because they realize that wishes don't change reality. That consciousness doesn't have primacy. And that democracy is not the vehicle to do that. The average person is retarded, and they're going to vote for whatever wishes wish that they have the most stuff. Right? That's fundamentally what democracy is always going to be. Most people still are going to believe in wishes, right? And that's not going to change thanks to granting them as many wishes as they want. That's not going to stop you giving everyone in effect a genie once every 4 years or however long it is, isn't going to make them stop believing in wishes, right? You need to stop giving people the genies. You need to fix the fucking philosophy, and then everything else becomes downstream from that. Because as you say, and as Hoppe points out, if you have democracy, it necessarily tends towards high time preference thinking. Because, well, you might get voted out the next term, buddy. You've only got a certain number of terms to do whatever the hell you want. Right, so you're going to try and reap as many rewards from this golden goose as you can in this short period you've got. So you're going to be more high time preference than you otherwise would be. You just are, right? There's no avoiding that. That is where the tendency is pointing towards, and this entirely plays on the minds of the retarded masses who are themselves going to be high time preference. They're not going to think about second order, third order, fifth order effects. They're not going to think about these things. So really, don't give them the opportunity to wish for things. Just set them at the market, and they can be as high time preference as they goddamn want, right? So long as it's not impoverishing entire nations in their wake.
Yeah, 100%. I wanted to obviously keep this mostly on the same topic, but kind of slightly different issue at play. So I had this tweet where, so someone was saying that, it's never happened in history. Hang on, let me get the tweet up properly. You know, this person was again responding to a similar aspect where the original tweet was saying, that if taxes are reduced or if rent control is alleviated, then prices will actually come down on net. And this person was being like, this is something that's never ever happened. And then I just posted a graph of the prices in Austin, Texas, and showed that, well, actually, Austin liberalized their rental market. They encouraged people to build homes. They relaxed the regulations on properties, and the end result of that was actually a decrease in the price of rentals and the price of homes, as would be predicted by Econ 101. But I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on. So obviously, I suppose the Austrian position on economics is obviously that we start with certain, use the term axioms, because that's typically what Austrians talk about, like man acts, and then you build up some knowledge about the implications of that from the basis of man acts. So there is this kind of superficial tension between that and objectivist epistemology. And so I wanted to ask, like, what do you think is the proper place for like empiricism or empirical evidence within kind of economic analysis? Do you kind of still agree with kind of the Rothbardian position, or is there kind of an element of objectivism that needs to be and a focus on having contact with quote unquote the real world in how we analyze economics in these particular cases?
Yeah, I think the Austrian prohibition on empiricism, what they're really talking about, in my view, is nominalism sensualism. This sort of like test and check method that comes from it. That's the real problem, because that's just pragmatism applied to economics, which indeed, very bad idea. Yeah, economics, in fact, is a distinct field of study. It's not mathematics. It's not anything else, right? It is economics. But really, what the Austrian position taken from an objectivist perspective is you start with the ground level facts. What can you observe? Well, you can observe there is such a thing called scarcity. You can observe that men do in fact act, right? That men engage in purposeful behavior. You can observe these things, and then you build up what is called general economic theory from that ground level starting point. When you start building this up, this general economic theory, then you can get all of Austrian economics from that, right? And that is inviolable, in effect. That's not going to be contradicted by any further observations. So that's the mistake. Now, sure, there could be fields of study where you study like history or something, and you start trying to apply the general economic theory into some particular case, but that's not going to change the general economic theory. The economic theory is set in stone, unless you think suddenly there's no such thing as scarcity in this instance. Right, and then, yeah, sure, general economic theory is going to start breaking down, but then reality also starts breaking down, because A is no longer A at that point.
Yeah, so I think obviously one of the tensions here is that like a lot of Austrians, particularly like Hopper and some of the others that adopt a more Kantian approach to epistemology, will kind of treat like the action axiom as like some rationalist a priori truth, because like to contradict it would be to act, or to attempt to contradict it would be to act. Therefore, it is some kind of synthetic a priori proposition that we can derive these rationalist truths from. From our perspective, would you say that like man acting is just like a very early observation that can be kind of adopted and treated as true by someone who's just like observing reality and being like, oh yeah, humans do appear to act? Is that kind of like where we're going with it?
Yeah, that's on the first level how you discover this, and then sure, you can go back and validate that with various like proofs by contradiction in effect. Like, hey, well, as it turns out, if determinism were true, then it leads to no longer having such a thing as truth because epistemology breaks down. So determinism definitely can't be true. Determinists cannot assert consistently that determinism is true. So what does that leave us with then? That determinism is not true, i.e., that free will is in fact true. So, but yeah, the way you get that knowledge in the first place is like, why is there a whole free will debate in the first place? Well, people clearly observe that humans, at the very prima facie, at the very least, seem to be engaging in vastly different behavior than like a rock falling down a hill. You can observe introspectively that you can choose the choice A over choice B. That's completely distinct to a rock, and that's why there's a whole field of study about free will. So yeah, that's not. We don't get there by this being like a necessary synthesizing filter in our brain. That's not the case, right? And the Kantians are completely mistaken about it. Like, oh well, therefore it must be a necessary synthesizing filter in our brain. Like, no, that jump doesn't make any goddamn sense. Don't be making that jump. You can observe that this is indeed a thing, and that this is the problem with the Kantians. They think, well, if it is indeed necessarily the case, then it must be one of these necessary synthesizing filters in our brain that filter out the noumenal data, whatever the fuck that means, right? That data, that's plural, kind of data about the noumenal, therefore. It is a fact of reality, not a fact of some other world that creates our reality. This is a observed thing that happens when you just look out, or look in this case. Then you can see that this is in fact the case. This is a fact about how our reality, the only reality, in fact, works.
100. I want to obviously tell people, like, look, this is another normal remnant. So if people want to jump up and contribute, then more than welcome to. I mean, if we don't get much people jumping in or much more, than like this could be a fairly short one. Like I think we have already been going for like an hour or so, maybe a little bit under. But I did have another tweet that I wanted to go through. So I think this was a really kind of, I guess, revealing tweet because it taps into, so when I was a wee lad growing up and first debating commies, they would often be like, no, our politics aren't motivated by envy. They're motivated by, compassion for the poor or something. Or that was typically like empathy. Like, we're just empathetic, bro. Like, just be a freaking